The White House Office of National Drug Policy has announced 150 new grants for its Drug-Free Community Support Program. That initiative aims to create and sustain partnerships to help combat substance abuse among young Americans.
The war on drugs has been official policy since the 1970s, but has it succeeded? In his new book, Pills, Powder, and Smoke Inside the Bloody War on Drugs, journalist Antony Loewenstein, he argues that the regulation of all drugs would be, quote, more realistic and a humane approach. He joins us now via Skype to expand a little bit on this. Antony, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Antony, just tell us a little bit about how the book came to be. How did you become involved in the subject? How did you go about reporting it and ultimately come to your conclusions?
So I spent the last 5 years traveling the world. I went to a lot of places where the drug war is particularly pronounced. Honduras, Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, the Philippines. Places where countries either are producing drugs, they're a transit country for drugs, or the Philippines, of course, where President Duterte has killed probably up to 30,000 civilians through his brutal drug war. And I also went to the US, UK, and Australia, and looking, I guess, how drug policy has changed. And I guess one of the reasons I wrote the book was, I think many people you speak to, including in the US, will say, well, US states are legalizing marijuana, the drug war is coming to an end, or this is just happening in Mexico. And Mexico is undeniably a brutal reality for the drug war. But in fact, the drug war has never been more brutal. And civilians around the world often are suffering because drugs are illegal. And the production and shipping of drugs to the West, the US, the UK, and Europe is meaning that a lot of people are suffering to get the drugs that we in the West want. I'm talking about legal and illegal drugs. The book focuses on illegal drugs. And I guess I argue after that this is not to suggest everyone should be going to a supermarket and buying heroin. Of course, it doesn't mean that. It means that looking at the reality of what a legalized, regulated market would be, most of the damage that the drug war is doing to people in the US is often drugs that are full of substances. You don't know what's in them. They're chemicals that are bad. They are unregulated. So a regulated system, which seems hard to imagine now, granted, is something I think that more serious policymakers are talking about, much more now than the last 10 years or so.
Antony, one of the things that frustrates me about the debate here is we talk a lot about immigration, but we never talk about the way that the war on drugs fuels that migration into the country. I was wondering if you could speak a little to that.
For sure. Look, I spent time in Honduras, which viewers will know is obviously a close neighbour of your country. And many of the people who are coming into the US, or at least trying to during the Trump era, coming from that country. And the reason why Honduras, for now at least 30 years, has been a key transit country, most of the cocaine coming into the US goes via Honduras. And the effect of that on the ground for civilians in Honduras is drug cartels are massively influential. I spent time with people everywhere in that country, and they talk about things like a war tax. So if you want to start a business, if you want to drive a bus, if you want a job, anything, you have to pay 1, 2, 3 taxes to a gang literally every week, or you will be shot dead. There's not even a question about that. The effect of that, it's not just about drugs, but drugs are a key part of that collapse of Honduran society. And that's why I didn't meet virtually anybody in Honduras who did not want to leave. Doesn't mean they all are going to leave. It just means that people want to leave. And the US, even during the Trump era, is seen as a potentially better option than staying in Honduras. So you're absolutely right. The drug war pursued by the US, and this is a bipartisan issue, by the way. The Trump administration has undeniably ramped up the drug war domestically and globally. But, for example, during many, many Democratic presidential periods, Clinton, much of Obama, the war was not much different. There were shifts during Obama, slightly, and some of the Democratic candidates for 2020, particularly Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren and others, have got moderately progressive policies, but they have a long way to go, in my view. Sanders is probably the best so far.
So, Antony, I think this comes down to a philosophical question of whether you think it is acceptable to allow these drugs kind of permeate your society. So legalization and regulation, in my view, is ultimately a surrender to the idea that it is permissible to have millions of your people using these illicit substances. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Should we take the fatalist view that people are just going to do it anyway? Or, part of the philosophy of the war on drugs is no, as a society, as a body politic, we say it's not good for people to be doing this.
And to be clear, me and many other people who advocate to legalise drugs are not encouraging people to take drugs. In fact, one of the things that you see in a country like Portugal, which has decriminalised all drugs for about 20 years, not legalised, but decriminalised everything from cannabis, heroin, ecstasy, whatever it may be. Drug use has gone down. Drug abuse has gone down. Now, people still abuse drugs, to be sure. But you take away the criminal element of that. You take away the possibility that someone who might be smoking a joint or taking an ecstasy pill should be criminalised. I don't think it, to me, so much is a fatalistic view about saying, well, everyone's going to take drugs, who cares? As a society, we should be, in fact, promoting the idea that people should not be taking drugs, should not be abusing drugs, but accepting the fact that the drug war has been going on now for really since Nixon, but arguably for 100 years. Right. Drug use and abuse in the US and in virtually every country in the world has never been worse. So unless one believes that we should spend more money and more resources on jailing people, criminalising more people, I think we accept the fact that drugs have always been a part of society. To me, for example, education about drugs should start unbelievably young, maybe not in kindergarten, but young. That there's an understanding that drugs can be a part of life. And also, to be clear, the majority of people who consume drugs, illicit substances, are not having trouble with it. They are doing it so-called normally. It's part of their life. Now, maybe you don't like that, and I can respect that, sure. But the truth is people not having trouble. It's about 5 to 10% of people have problems with drug use and abuse. And to me, I think a mature society, and Portugal is the best example we have in the world so far, of a society obviously much smaller than the US, true, but a society which recognised 20 or so years ago that criminalising drug use and abuse was failing. I mean, it had the worst HIV rates in Europe. And 20 years on, the results really speak for themselves. And I think in the US now, when you have policies like the recently announced Bernie Sanders policy, which talks about not just legalising marijuana in his first 100 days federally, but expunging the record of people who had marijuana convictions. I mean, last year in 2018, even though many, many US states have legalized marijuana and more will do so, the FBI arrest rate had gone up from the year before. There's still over 600,000 Americans, often people of color and poor whites, who are being criminalized, often for minor drug infractions. So the question really is, do we, as a society, want that reality? And I would argue, and many experts increasingly say, that this is not a sustainable model at all, unless you believe that people should be criminalised for what is generally minor, non-violent abuse.
Right. Well, and to your point, I mean, we have been interdicting heroin for 100 years, and yet we have the worst opioid crisis, the worst probably addiction crisis in our nation's history. So at some point you have to admit that this hasn't worked. I will tell you, I've taken a close look at the drug policies, and I think about these things in a very similar way to you. Andrew Yang has explicitly embraced the Portugal model. Bernie Sanders has not. So you should take a look at that. But Antony, thank you so much for your work.
Thanks, Antony.
Great work on the book. We appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, guys.
And we'll have more Rising after this.